I want to be very careful with how I begin this, because moments like this demand precision, not drama. People are tired of warnings. They've been told for years that the system is about to break, and every time it somehow holds. That has created a dangerous kind of confidence, the belief that institutional collapse is something that only happens elsewhere, to weaker states, to unstable societies. That belief is now being tested. What we are really seeing here is not a sudden crisis, but the delayed result of pressures that have been building quietly for years. Executive power expanding, legislative authority weakening, judicial legitimacy becoming politicized. None of this is new. What is new is that these forces are now colliding openly, without the usual restraints. An emergency session of Congress has been convened. That is not routine. Congress does not move urgently unless something fundamental has gone wrong. This is not about optics. This is about risk management, political, legal, and economic risk. Behind the closed doors of that session, the discussion is not about ideology. It's about precedent. Because once a line is crossed at this level, it doesn't just affect the current administration. It reshapes the system for everyone who comes after. At the center of this moment is a basic constitutional question that sounds abstract, but is incredibly concrete in its consequences. Who actually controls state power when institutions disagree? The Constitution was designed to make power slow, divided, and frustrating. That was intentional. Efficiency was never the goal. Restraint was. The power of the purse was given to Congress precisely to prevent a single executive from unilaterally reshaping national priorities through money. Over the past several weeks, the restraint has been challenged directly. Large amounts of funding, explicitly authorized by Congress for specific purposes, were redirected without approval. Not delayed, not negotiated, or directed. That distinction matters because it turns a political disagreement into a constitutional breach. When Congress objected, the expectation, based on 2 centuries of precedent, was negotiation. Instead, the response was pressure. Government operations slowed. Agencies stalled. The shutdown was used not as leverage for compromise, but as a tool to exhaust resistance. This is not accidental. This is how power tests limits. Push, observe the response, push again. Then the judiciary intervened. A federal judge issued a ruling that did not hedge, did not soften its language, and did not pretend the issue was unclear. The ruling stated plainly that the executive action violated constitutional limits. In a functioning system, that is where escalation stops. But escalation didn't stop. Instead, the authority of the court itself was challenged. The idea that judicial rulings are binding was publicly undermined. And that is the point where this stops being a political fight and becomes a systemic one. Because if court rulings are optional, then law itself becomes optional. This is where markets enter the picture, not emotionally, not politically, but mechanically. Markets are not patriotic. They do not care about speeches or loyalty. They care about predictability, about enforcement, about whether contracts, laws, and rulings mean tomorrow what they mean today. The value of American markets has never been about perfection. It has been about trust that institutions constrain power, that disputes are resolved through law, and that no individual can override the system indefinitely. When that trust weakens, capital adjusts. Quietly at first. Hedging increases. Exposure shifts. Long-term commitments pause. None of this makes headlines, but all of it shows up in data. Bond yields react. Currency positions rebalance. Risk models change. This is not panic. This is logic. Foreign governments understand this better than most citizens. Strategic competitors do not need to interfere when a system destabilizes itself. They simply wait, observe, and adjust their own strategies accordingly. Internal political pressure is now intense. Within the ruling party, the contradiction is becoming impossible to manage. Defending policy objectives while rejecting the method requires pretending that the method doesn't matter. But the method is the entire issue. Some lawmakers are attempting to delay, hoping the moment passes. Others are trying to redefine the issue as partisan conflict rather than constitutional breach. But neither approach resolves the core problem. There is a deeper political struggle underway here between loyalty to an individual and loyalty to the system that grants legitimacy to power in the first place. History shows that this struggle rarely ends cleanly. The opposition understands this dynamic and is proceeding carefully. There is no rush because time strengthens their position. Every ruling, every defiance statement, every institutional clash adds to the record. Blame is already being prepared not just for political outcomes, but for systemic failure. When markets react, when confidence drops, when costs rise, there will be a narrative ready to explain why. And looming over all of this is the Supreme Court. The court is being pulled toward a confrontation it has spent decades trying to avoid. If it intervenes and sides with expanded executive authority, it permanently alters the balance of power. If it rules against the executive and is ignored, judicial authority collapses in practice. Either outcome weakens the system. This is the strategic trap. There is no ruling that restores stability without cost. That is why the terms being discussed guarantee rejection. There is no compromise position between constitutional supremacy and personal discretion. Any deal that avoids the question simply delays the next crisis. What makes this moment uniquely dangerous is not the individual at the center of it. It is the precedent being created. Once power is exercised beyond limits and survives, it becomes normalized. Future leaders do not need to be reckless. They simply need to point backward and say, this was allowed. That is how systems hollow out not through collapse, but through reinterpretation. The most likely outcome is prolonged instability. Legal battles stretching on. Markets pricing in uncertainty. Institutions continuing to function, but with diminished authority and public trust. The best case scenario is containment limits reasserted, but at real political and economic cost. The worst case scenario is acceptance, a new normal where limits exist only when they are convenient. History rarely announces turning points in real time. They become clear later, when people look back and identify the moment restraint failed. We are very close to one of those moments now. The question is no longer whether the situation is serious. The question is whether the system still has the will to enforce its own rules when doing so becomes politically dangerous. And once that answer becomes uncertain, the consequences do not arrive all at once. They arrive slowly. Then suddenly,